At Computex in 2019, Fractal showed us a secret room with a secret case. It was the original Fractal ERA, and as you know, it was a little bit of an error. This, ladies and gents, is the brand new Fractal ERA 2, also shown off at a secret room in Computex, but that was this year. Let's do our usual thing. Let's see what the deal is with this $199 small form factor case from Fractal. Have they made it better? Is this even classified as a Fractal ERA? Let's find out. Let's start off with panel removal. We can remove the top panel first, and I'm showing you this because I think it's nice to have this removed when you're building, but the easiest way to do it is you'll notice on this wood panel, there are two lines, and basically what you want to do is push down, and then you can lift the wood panel away from the top of the case. And yeah, it's just a nice little mechanism. However, the correct way to get into the ERA 2 is via the bottom of the case. You'll notice there's this little handle on the back side, and it's got a little lock icon. What you want to do is put two fingers underneath that, and this is the filter. This is pretty genius, and you slide this panel out, and then you lift the whole top of the case off, and that gives you access to the internal frame. Essentially what this is a lock for the case. It's also a dust filter that runs along the entire bottom of the case. Next up, removing the top panel of the case. To remove the top panel, you'll notice that there's these little eyelets at the top, and they're on the front and the back. And essentially what you want to do is you pull them the same direction, and then you can push and lift the top panel away from the case. And this, my friends, is radiator mounting, and we'll come back to that in a moment. While not necessary, the bottom of the case can also be removed. There's screw holes in each corner where the rubber feet are, and basically what you do is you remove those screws, and then you push the panel towards the front of the case, and it kind of unlocks it, and you can lift that panel away from the case, and then that gives you access to the fans on the bottom of the case. So if you wanted to switch these out, you can. And this is just standard 120 millimeter fan mounts on the bottom of the case. You can basically put any fan that you like at the bottom there. But again, as mentioned, this is not really required if you're going to be like me and you're going to use the stock bottom fans. The ERA 2 has two pre-installed 120mm PWM fans, and these will both spin up to around 2000 RPM. They can be removed quite easily, which we're not doing in this video because I did want to use these fans because I think it's a good way to measure thermals. This will fit underneath any GPU that will go in this case because it's specifically designed for that. For power supply support, the ERA 2 supports SFX and SFX-L power supplies, and the way it does this is there's this removable bracket here, and everything on this case is kind of put together in a modular way, classic Scandinavian style if I'm being honest. Then you mount your power supply to the bracket, and then you just slide your power supply back into place like that. Be aware though, if you are using an SFX-L power supply, they are slightly longer, and it may impede your options for liquid cooling. I think this is a pretty elegant solution for power supplies, if I'm being honest. We'll just do that again so you guys can see. How easy is that? On the back side of the case, there's the power extension cable. You'll find this with most small form factor cases. This is pretty standard. And the other end of the cable, which is a regular IEC power connector, plugs into your power supply. And this is what the cable looks like. It's really flat and it's right angled, and it should be able to fit in without touching anything underneath it. Similarly, like power supply mounting, the SSD sleds are kind of the same. Uses the same rail system. There's a single screw, and then we can slide out this 2.5-inch SSD mounting bracket. As you can see here, you can have two 2.5-inch drives mounted into this bracket. Makes it very easy to install even after the fact, because you can have the GPU already installed and then get underneath the GPU, because yes, this does sit directly underneath the GPU because the GPU is vertically mounted. We'll also come back to that. That's not the only place to mount drives. There is also optional drive mounting on this bracket here, between the back of your graphics card and the power supply if you have the optional brackets, but we don't have those here. Fan and radiator support is just about the most interesting and important thing in the Era 2. Here's the bottom line. It can do up to a 280mm liquid cooler or radiator on the top of the case, but there are some caveats, and let's explore because it's about to get a little bit tricky, so follow along. The internal maximum size for your radiator is 300mm in length. That includes end tanks because we do have these classic locking mechanisms for that top panel. That being said, we also then have a maximum supported thickness of around about 68mm from the top frame to where the bottom of your fans would sit. And the recommended width, I would say, would be around about 52mm to be on the safe side. You have to remember, we need to be able to clear this power cable. And if you're using something like a 4090 Founders Edition, you'll want to be able to clear the top of the graphics card and a 12-volt high power connector. That said, a right angle connector would be optimal for a case like this. I'm not sure that I've got one, but we're going to see what we can do to make it all work within specs so we don't make any graphics cards catch on fire. And that's really it here, guys. So recommended, they say 240mm for the liquid cooler at the top. I would tend to agree with them because you have to remember tube runs are very important for these liquid cooled builds as well. Like the Fractal Terra, the Era 2 has an adjustable center spine. The default shipped configuration is position number 3, as you can see here by these numbers, 1, 2, and 3. And essentially what this allows us to do is to change the offset to either bias the case for air cooling or for a really thick GPU. How this works is there are 4 locations on the case, 2 on the front, 2 on the back, and this one is a little bit more elegant because basically what they've done is they've put little kind of raised bits here to hold the screw in its place. But really all you need to do is figure out your configuration, plan your build accordingly, and then change the offset. So in the build that we'll be doing for this video, we'll leave it in number 3, but here's why you would change it. This is position number 3, and the reason why you'd use this position is to maximize your GPU length and width. So if you're thinking of using something crazy like a 4090 Founders Edition, and would also fit with a 280mm liquid cooler at the top of the case as well. So in terms of the specifications of position number 3, for maximum GPU length, you're looking at around about 315mm. The GPU width is about 58mm. The pump height would have to be no more than 45mm. You can do a 280, but I would recommend probably a 240 just for additional clearance because sometimes 280mm liquid coolers can be wider and longer than that spec. I hope that makes sense to you guys. But the major limitation you're going to have is the CPU cooler height being only 55mm. I hope this is making sense to you guys. However, if we were to change this to the other extreme in position number 1, hopefully this translates well to video, but in position number 1, you're reducing your GPU length to 267mm, which means that you are limiting yourself quite a bit. However, what you are losing, you're gaining with air cooler clearance because you're looking at clearances up to 70mm. That is 15 mils more than if it was in position 3. And then in position 2, which is probably one that you might not use, you kind of get a balance of both. Now, here's where I throw a spanner in the works and confuse you even more about everything that I mentioned with the spine offset, because the GPU clearance for position 3 is 315mm. However, you have a maximum length of 326mm because the GPU can be passed through the front of the case. And to be honest, there isn't additional room behind the panel, but you can basically go all the way up to the edge of this panel here. Like I mentioned, there is a hole on the front of the case, which makes it a lot easier for passing GPUs through and installing them. A lot of GPUs won't require this, but again, it is a nice to have. Keep in mind though, some GPUs, especially ones that exceed the 3 slot width, which is very common, you won't be able to pass them through the front and you won't be able to use them in this case at all. So the rule applies here. The same thing that I always say when we cover small form factor cases, research what will fit in your case before buying any parts or picking any parts, especially with cases like the Era 2. Because this is a small form factor case, the Era 2 only supports mini ITX motherboards. No surprises there, right? For case wiring, we've got the front panel connectors for the lights and the switches. We've got a USB Type-C cable, a USB Type-A cable, and front panel audio. There's also an included PCIe Gen 4x16 riser cable, so for your graphics card, you shouldn't have any issues whatsoever with connectivity. On the front panel itself, there's a power button with a combined power LED, a 3.5mm jack, a USB Type-C port, and 2 USB Type-A ports. To be honest with you, I know there's a lot to go through and it can be quite confusing and quite daunting, especially with small form factor cases with multiple internal outs. So I hope I've helped you understand that a little bit better, but we're not going to be able to know anything about this without building in it. So let's do a build. Here are the thermals for the Fractal ERA 2. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the thermals aren't too bad. You have to remember, guys, this is a worst case scenario for these type of tests, and this is why we do it, because people want to know what the absolute worst situation will look like. And for a small case like this, with a 9900X, a 280mm liquid cooler, and an RTX 4090 Founders Edition, I would say that the thermals aren't too bad at all. And I gotta say, probably better than any type of thermals that you would have found with the original Era, which was a swing and a miss from Fractal. But the Era 2 is looking a lot more promising. If you're interested in any of the hardware used in this build, there's a PT part picker list down below. You can check that out at your own leisure. But what do I think about the Era 2? Well, this is a nice change for Fractal, considering the last nice small form factor case they made was the Terra, and we absolutely loved the Terra. And essentially what they've done here is they've got the internals of the Terra, figured out what works, and then made the case slightly taller, slightly wider to accommodate much bigger cooling capacity. As for the build that I did, I've got a couple notes. First of all, take a look at this. This is what it looks like on the side with the motherboard for the cooler and all the wiring and everything. It is an absolute freaking mess. And even with trying to cable manage it, it is quite difficult. That said though, this cooler with the screen and RGB controller and all this other stuff is not necessary at all. But I wanted to see what it would look like if you were to use something like this. I decided to go with a 280mm cooler, which, if I'm being honest, maybe it's a little bit too tight for my liking, but I did make it work. There were some pretty interesting tube runs here, which you'll see, and I used some cable ties to hold it all down, but nothing rubs, nothing fouls. Everything spins right, like it's all good here. To manage all the cables on this power supply, this is an SFX power supply, so it's slightly longer, and it does make it more difficult because the cables can touch the fan on the liquid cooler. To combat this, I would say you could probably get some fan grills so you wouldn't have that problem, but for this build, I didn't put them on there basically because I don't have any. But I would say if you're going for something like this, that would make a bit more sense. As well as that, the concerns with the 12-volt high power cable, I know we're gonna get questions about this. It fits, it bends nicely, and it's not bent to the point where it's not gonna be plugged in properly and burn your card and set it on fire. I think we're past all that now, but as you're seeing here, it's really not that bad. And overall, I've gotta say the building experience with this case is okay. It's not hard, but it is very time consuming, especially when you choose components like this. There is one thing that I don't like about the Era 2, and this may not apply to you, but this is something that I noticed when I was testing and while I wanted to have the system on. If you have everything plugged in, look, you can't take off the top of the case to inspect and see what's going on because it's all blocked by the bottom of the panel here, which is fine because it's a very peculiar use case. Like, you're probably not going to be doing that, but for me, who builds PCs, who wants to investigate things and not have to shut the system down, yeah, that's the only thing. That's it. That's it. Everything else is really, really nice. And this is an example of how good the clearances are, even with this ridiculous amount of hardware, with my crappy cable management. No problems going on and off whatsoever, other than the other thing that I mentioned with the power cable hanging out the back and you not being able to completely take the case off. But that's the thing, ladies and gents. If you're going smaller, it's always going to be a little bit trickier, a little bit more expensive, and a little bit more work to get the exact build that you want. That's half the fun of it. With saying that, as I said earlier in the video, if you're building with something like the Era 2, you need to do a bit of research and figure out what's going to fit. I would say that Fractal's done a much better job here than they did with the original Era, which wasn't hard because that case was a big swing and a miss. It was gorgeous, but the performance just wasn't there. And I think they may have done a much better job here with the Era 2. I would even go as far as saying that they shouldn't have even called this the Era 2. They could have just given it a brand new name because it's not really that similar to the original Era, right? Yeah, I don't hate it. It's a pretty decent case, and the wood panel on the top. You know how I feel about wood panels. They always smell so good and they look gorgeous. I especially love this silver version of the case too, because you know why I love silver. The quality here is immensely good. It's immaculate. It looks so good. Yeah, and this is less of like a gaming PC case. This is more of a work of art. It sounds so lame to say that, but this is that nice. And I don't think it's going to translate that well in video. If you do get a chance to see this in person, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a very beautiful piece of kit. If you're interested in the Fractal ERA 2, it's going for around about $199 US. I'm not sure what that equates to in Australian dollars at the time of filming this video, because I'm filming this video a lot earlier than this case is coming out, because by the time you see this, I'll probably be in China. Let us know what you think of the Era 2. I think this is a great case. This is a nice small form factor case. Not too big, not too small, just right.